Hey guys, what's up? This is Carl, and I'm here with the Orthodox squad, and we're back for another episode. Today we've got a very special guest. It's Jay Dyer, and we're going to be discussing the key points of divergence between our theology and Catholic theology, seeing as we do live in a Western world, and that is a pretty major way of how our societies kind of function. Jay, could you start by introducing yourself for those of us that don't know who you are?
Yeah, my name is Jay Dyer. I do a website called jaysanalysis.com. I've been doing that for about 10, 11 years. I cover a lot of geopolitics. I cover a lot of philosophy, film reviews. I do a lot of media work with people like Alex Jones. I've done a Tucker special recently. So I cover a lot of areas, but we also do a lot of religious debates, apologetics, and particularly focusing on things like atheism, Islam, and Roman Catholicism's difference between us, or the difference with us and Orthodoxy. The difference between us, between Rome and Orthodoxy, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So I'm sure like lots of our fan base would know who you are, but you can't be. I'm sure lots of new viewers hopefully come see this and they find out and go down the rabbit hole. And I've seen so many converts that have converted because they've watched your content. So it's always a plus. And I think I'm going to just start by...
and also to add on that, not only converts, even like cradle Orthodox people from Serbia, they were like, yeah, I watched Jay and I got back into church thanks to him.
That's good news.
Here in Australia.
You watch him too.
That was good.
So I'm going to start by just going for the elephant in the room. The main issue of divergence is papal primacy and authority. Jay, could you start by elaborating on that? And
yeah, so I do agree with that, but I think that the reason that papal primacy came to be has theological predecessors. So it's actually a more fundamental theological difference that's the result even of the papal stuff. So certainly filioque and all that matters, and certainly the position of the Bishop of Rome matters. But I think that prior to the ecclesiological differences in 1054 or whatever, there was already beginning to be a divergence between how the two groups would see the triad. So when we begin to have more of an Augustinian approach to the triad in the West after successive centuries, after the after Toledo, after the Carolinian period, the Franks go in an explicitly filioquist direction. And so the more that we see that Augustinian theology dominating the West, the less we see the prevalence of the monarchia of the Father. Now, that doesn't mean that Augustine explicitly and totally denied the monarchy of the Father, but it certainly it becomes a difficult thing in his position. And there's definitely a difference between the Cappadocian model of the triad that's accepted at the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople I and the Augustinian model. So actually root the ecclesiological divergence in the triad, in the theological differences, because that will really condition what we call the ordo theologia, the order of theology. And that means the way that we go about in terms of first principles doing our theological dogmatics. So you'll notice the church historically did dogmatics from the place of Trinitarian theology first with Nicaea and Constantinople I, and then Christology for the next successive councils all the way up until 8 and 9. And you could argue even, 7 and 8, and you could argue the 9th Palamite synods as well. All are really just the outworkings of correct Trinitarian and Christological formulations. So basically, the diverging triads, in my view, I agree with the argumentation of Dr. Philip Sherrard in his book, Church, Papacy, Schism, where he notes that this imbalance in the notion of the triad is partly what gives way to the imbalance in ecclesiology. So you had an older model, the first 1,000 years of the church, that I think is the Orthodox model, which it's maintained, which is synodality and collegiality. There's canonical privileges for certain bishops, but what we get with the rise of the filioque, and I don't think it's accidental in the West, is also the rise of the place of the Bishop of Rome. And Sherrard, I think, convincingly argues that there's a metaphysical imbalance in the theology of Rome that also leads to this sort of wonky, wacky ecclesiology that plays itself out in the rise of the papacy being an autocrat. And this is admitted now. That's the amazing part, is that multiple Roman Catholic historians and theologians, like books like Congar, first after 900 years, Phocian Schism by Dvornik. I mean, these have really led the Roman Catholic Church to kind of do a revisionist stance on the first 1,000 years, and admit, if you saw the recent Alexandrian document that we did a live stream on, this is a papally approved commission, basically admitting about 90-95% of the Orthodox points on ecclesiology in the first millennium. So I would take that to be pretty significant. I mean, the fact that Rome is admitting these things in these theological admissions is pretty damaging, especially how that contradicts what's stated very clearly at Vatican I. And that's, of course, the Roman Catholic Council, where they dogmatized the position of the papacy. So we have really these admissions, and I don't mean, I want to be clear, because people misunderstood, I guess, when I was saying this on a live stream with Snack and David the other day. I'm not saying that the Alexandria document from Rome means that it's now time to unite with Rome. I am saying that the Alexandria document admits our positions, and therefore means that the Roman Catholic Church was incorrect primarily in Vatican I. And the way that system works is that if Vatican I is correct, the system is incorrect. You see, it's not a piecemeal thing, because it's premised on the doctrine of the papacy. The papacy is the means by which you identify the true church in the Roman Catholic system. And if Vatican I, which dogmatized that point, is false, then their whole conception of the church is false. And again, the Chieti document and the Alexandria document are essentially admitting our points. And so therefore, Roman Catholicism cannot be true, even on its own document and its own formulations. So what do we have here? Well, we have, again, rival systems within systems. So my view of the Latin Church is, if you read the Michael Welton book, there's a great chapter on the Gregorian reforms, which is what Congar admits was a radical revolution in the structure of the church in the West. The Gregorian reforms are really where we get the Franco-papal medieval notions of the papacy and the Pope as this autocrat and geopolitical figure, right? We have documents like Dictatus Papae, which is a famous document outlining all of these kind of outlandish things and claims that are necessary for you to believe to be saved about the temporal power of the papacy. Likewise, Unum Sanctum makes temporal supremacy a doctrine that is necessary for salvation as well. If you do not submit to the temporal supremacy of the Bishop of Rome, you cannot be saved. Unum Sanctum is adamantly clear about that. So I think that we can see that the Roman Catholic position itself on the temporal power has just exploded right after the 11th century, due precisely to these factors, spiritual, theological, and geopolitical. All of those play into how we got the modern papacy as we know it, that evolves and develops, even according to their own system, all the way up until the time of Vatican I, that Newman idea of development. That's just fundamentally different from what we have in the Orthodox view, which is synodality, collegiality, the equality of bishops, but there might be canonical privileges that are given in certain councils. And we see this at Nicaea when it ranks Rome and then, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, right? And then we get the question later on of New Rome at Constantinople I, in the canons is given the place next to Old Rome. That's not accepted at Chalcedon by Leo, because Leo says that it's unfair to Alexandria to automatically rank New Rome second, and it has nothing to do with papal supremacy. So papal apologists have taken Canon 28 of Chalcedon as an example of, oh, look, Leo is rejecting canons because he has the ultimate authority as a pope to decide what canons bind the church. That's not at all what happens. He's appealing to the fact that Nicaea gave Alexandria the second place, and so it's not fair to do that. Later on, however, the Roman Church did eventually accept Constantinople as second to Old Rome, namely the papacy. So what this shows us is that nothing about this canonical structure is inherently magically from God. I mean, it's in divine providence. There's no divine law that says that because Rome is first in the canons or first in the ecumenical councils, that it is infallible, or any of the other Vatican I claims. And again, the recent documents bear out this fact. So obviously we could go a lot more into that, but I think just to get back to that theological point, the filioque doctrine is tied into this and is part and parcel with the rise of the medieval papacy, because in the medieval era, what we actually see is, like, theologically speaking, it's almost as if the church, the Pope sends the Spirit to the church. And that's because there's this imbalance in the triad to where the Holy Spirit ends up being subordinated, excuse me, because he supposedly now lacks the power of causing a person, which is in Roman Catholic theology somehow the defining characteristic of what makes the Son equal to the Father. So the Son is equal to the Father because he sends the Holy Spirit. So if equality of divinity is now tallied up on the basis of being a cause, then the Holy Spirit is less divine because he doesn't cause anybody. He doesn't cause a person. So he lacks an essential power or property that the Father and the Son share together. And again, that whole model, whether it's St. Photius in the Mystagogy or whether it's St. Gregory Palamas in the Apodictic Treatise, that whole model is skewed precisely because it is removing the notion of hypostatic property and what is proper to the Father in terms of what picks out his person. Cause picks out the person of the Father. Therefore, there cannot be a co-cause or a secondary cause in the Son. So the Son cannot participate in the hypostatic property of what picks out the Father. And that was said by St. Photius long ago. It was said by St. Gregory Palamas in the Apodictic Treatise, basically rewording and restating a lot of the argumentation of St. Photius. And that's where we are. So what happens? Well, if the Spirit gets subordinated, then now the Holy Spirit is something that is not fully present unless Rome grants it to you, you see. And that's exactly what happens in the medieval period when the Roman bishop now has to appoint every bishop in the world. There's no way that everybody knows this didn't exist in the first 1,000 years. In fact, the recent Alexandria document admits this. The Roman bishop didn't confirm all bishops in the world. But if you think that the Roman bishop is really the conduit of the Holy Spirit, right, then it actually kind of makes sense. And so that's why he would want that power and that authority. But really, this is just a deformation and a aberration that has led to Vatican I and to now a lot of the embarrassment. I mean, if people are really honest about it, Chieti and Alexandria are really embarrassments because they're really just admitting most of our positions.
So I've seen the Chieti document before. I mean, it's pretty, I think it's a bit pretty incriminating. And the other one is, I wanted to point out that Dvornik is actually a Catholic historian theologian, not an Orthodox one. And that the book, the Photian Schism, delves into the topic and basically says, you guys are right about Photius. So I think that's very interesting. And to sum up for you guys watching what Jay said about the filioque, what's happening there is it splits the singular source in the Godhead into two by the double possession, and it thus splits the adoration into two adorations of two divinities. So the essence is one because it's one source and one Father. So to confess two principal sources is to confess two essences in a dyad. And
absolutely, yeah, that's the argumentation of Photius, correct.
So by adoration, I mean the worship given by man to God the Father by worshiping his Son in spirit and truth. So worship is solely a creaturely act. God is both a monad and a triad. So he's monad in essence, but triad in how his persons relate to creation. The Trinity is a monad in essence, but not in persons. So we have to make this distinction, which I feel like people say, that's why we're not polytheistic, because we do believe that in essence, God is one. So short bit of Islamic apologetics there. When they say that you're a polytheist because there's three gods, no, there's three persons in the one God. That's a distinction that has to be made. So basically, what's happened is that what Jay is saying, that because of the filioque, we now have this notion that developed over time of papal primacy and authority. And these two issues have caused a plethora of other theological differences that have continued to diverge over the years in just completely different ways. One of these things is, I think, well, we all know the Immaculate Conception, Purgatory. Could you explain when you think that, because, okay, just a quick point. I find that with some of these doctrines, like the Immaculate Conception, they're very, very recent. Why do you think they've decided now they want to bring them up, Jay?
That's a good point and a good question. Sometimes I think that Roman Catholicism historically will define a doctrine because they see it expedient at that time to do so. So, for example, even though this is not a dogma, certain devotions, for example, will rise at a time when they see it useful for combating a Protestant error. So, for example, in the Counter Reformation, Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuits were very much into promoting the notion of Eucharistic adoration. So adoration arose as a kind of folk piety way to counteract the argumentation of the reformers. I think likewise, when it comes to doctrines like the Immaculate Conception, that might have had a political expedient component at that time that the Roman Church wanted to sort of beef up its stances against certain things. I think Vatican II is an example of this as well, where Vatican II is a geopolitically expedient council as well. It happens because they think that it'll be this way to lure Protestants back, to lure Orthodox back. So that's a big part of the motivations, I think, at times why they do it. But I think that another reason is that some of these doctrines are novelties and they're aberrations. And so when they become controversial because of the nature of the Roman Catholic system, if the papacy can define it, then it's supposedly no longer up for debate, right? So if there's a controversial doctrine by the nature of that system, if it might expose or cause embarrassment or damage to the system, to dogmatically define it would then, for the Roman Catholic pious, it would end the debate. So that's another reason they do it, is that all right, people are questioning this thing that's kind of absurd. So let's dogmatically define it. I mean, those would be my guesses as to why something is that late. Another reason it's that late is that it doesn't have early testimony. I mean, we shouldn't overlook the obvious, which is that the Immaculate Conception is bound up with a very rigorous Augustinian view of libido dominandi and human anthropology. It's also bound up with Augustine's confusion of nature and person in anthropology and in the triad as well. And so you're going to get this mass damnata view that then affects his view of the status of infants, infant baptism, infant damnation, which is admitted in the papal documents, by the way. If you look at the Holy Office's statement on infant baptism and limbo, the limbo of children, it admits that this was really the dominant view after Augustine. And then we get those statements in Denzinger. I can pull it up if we need to. I got my Denzinger ready, but there's early Middle Ages begins to temper this doctrine with the Roman Catholic idea of limbo of infants. So that's a long-winded answer, I guess, to say that, well, there's just not a lot of early testimony to some of these things. And so they feel the need, I think, to vindicate the system has to be propped up at all costs because it's supposed to be an unfalsifiable system. I mean, the papal system, in other words.
When they bring it up sometimes, what I find is that they don't care about the consensus patrum. Like, clearly, the Immaculate Conception is not the consensus patrum, even by your own scholars. Like, if you look at Aquinas, you look at Augustine, the two main guys for you, they don't believe in the Immaculate Conception. Aquinas specifically wrote apologetics against the Immaculate Conception. So that's another issue we diverge. We have a notion of the consensus patrum. The reason we can say that Augustine was wrong about one specific thing, or a different saint was wrong about one specific thing, is because they might have deviated in some way from the consensus patrum. We believe, however, that the consensus of the church fathers is not a doctrine that we can just develop later on and turn into something else.
Absolutely.
Another thing
also,
that I think...
sorry, I just wanted to say, regarding the Immaculate Conception, isn't that linked with also they have a different view than us on original sin? They believe in original guilt and have the idea of original guilt behind them as well, right?
It depends on who you're
they will
talking
say
to.
nowadays they don't believe in original guilt, but there are periods, and again, that's why that limbo doctrine from the Holy Office is really important, because it does admit that from the time of Augustine up to Gregory the Great, up until the like maybe 900s or the year 1000, the original guilt and mass damnata, that means the damned mass of everybody in Adam, including infants, that was the normative view in the West. So that's when they begin to temper it in the Middle Ages with the limbo of infants doctrine, which is eventually, by the way, dogmatized. So it's odd to me that the Holy Office would say that you could now kind of doubt limbo. You don't have to hold to it because it's clearly in Denzinger, it's clearly dogmatic. But and I don't mean to cut you off there, Hattie. I was just going to say that we have to be careful, because if you say that, oh, you guys believe in original guilt, they will pull out the modern catechism, which which denies original guilt.
That's what I was going to say. Yep. It depends on who you're talking to. That's what I find with Catholics, is that you can speak to one and they will believe in a doctrine of original sin. It's like almost identical to us. You speak to another one, it's like, no, they don't. So that's not, I don't know, it's not as united as the papacy claims it brings unity, but it still allows people to hold completely different theologies and say, you know, we're united.
Well, just look at the fact that you could be a uniate or a Melkite and say you only believe in 7 ecumenical councils, and say that I don't care about the Council of Trent and Purgatory and all this stuff, which clearly in the Roman Catholic system, you don't have the right to reject Trent.
So on the Melkite official website, I don't know if it was in Australia or America, it actually said we believe in 7 ecumenical councils on the diocese website.
Right.
Another thing that was, you were speaking about limbo, so a middle place. That's another issue that I want to bring up. Purgatory. We have this thing called Hades, but it's significantly different from purgatory. So they believe that your soul undergoes purification before entering heaven, and we don't share the doctrine in the same way. It's nuanced. Jay, could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, one important element to not overlook in this, in terms of purgatory, is the notion of indulgences. You can't really separate those two views in the Roman Catholic system, which of course Orthodoxy doesn't have the doctrine of indulgences. So in the Roman Catholic system, they believe that sin incurs a twofold penalty, a temporal debt and an eternal debt. Internal debt if it's a mortal serious sin, a temporal debt if it's only a venial sin, but a mortal sin can also have both temporal and venial, temporal and eternal consequences. So the basis of it, the doctrine of indulgence is that the debt that you owe in confession, it can be forgiven when the priest gives you absolution, but that's only the eternal debt. The temporal debt is still outstanding, and they'll cite texts like where David prays to God that, you know, he repents for having Uriah killed, and then God says, I've forgiven you, but the child will still die. And so they'll see, you still have these payments. The weird part is that it becomes this system based in the early canons, because in the early church, for example, the canons, it would say, you know, if you cheat on your wife, the bishop might impose a penance of 2 years where you don't partake of the Eucharist, something like this, right? So the idea is that, oh, let's tabulate how many days is that. Let's say it's 1 year. Okay, so you have a 365-year temporal debt that you owe. And because in the canons of the ancient church, a bishop, if he saw you as repentant because he could forgive you, there is the idea that certain devotions and actions can forgive the temporal debt. So purgatory exists to pay off the temporal debt that you owe. So maybe you committed a bunch of sins, you went to confession, you die the next day, but you haven't paid off the 4,332 days of temporal payment in purgatory that you owe. I'm not joking. That's how ridiculous it is. Like this weird bean counter system. So that's where they derived all of this. And that in part is why Luther, for example, railed against Johann Tetzel, the monk, who was saying every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. So if you pay money for the indulgences, you're getting your loved ones out of purgatory. And that was an abuse, and it was clearly, a silly money-making racket. So Luther was correct to call that out, and he's absolutely correct as well that doesn't exist in the first 1,000 years of the church. There's none of this. There's no payments indulgence system of a bunch of bean counting. It's crazy. But it is what it developed in the Roman Catholic system, and it is integral to their theology because it's bound up with the notion of the temporal debts, as we said, that are due after. That's what purgatory is really connected to. So you can't divorce it from that. We have to keep that in mind. And if you read St. Mark of Ephesus's homilies against the Latins after the Council of Florence, he points out, the absurdity of the Orthodox not being able to. The Orthodox could never accept the absurdity of this notion of a temporal fire. So that's another important thing we have to keep in mind, is that There's no such thing as a created fire of God. Paul says that our God is an all-consuming fire. That means God is an uncreated energy of fire. When the burning bush is burning, it's not a created fire. It's the uncreated fire of God's presence. So God is not a created fire. So there's no notion of this. Again, it's bound up with the Roman Catholic theology of created grace. So all of those things are connected. But yeah, I think that's the key thing that we have to remember with infant limbo. And it is dogmatized, I think somewhere in the 1300s. I can find the exact thing on this, but if you're looking for an essay, I did write an essay on this critiquing Taylor Marshall, because Taylor Marshall actually fell into a bunch of mistakes on this. And I went into the development of the Roman Catholic view, particularly as we get up past limbo in the Middle Ages. I think it's in the 1300s, being dogmatized, infant limbo. And then by the time of the recent Pontifical Commission statement on infant limbo basically being optional.
You know, what I just want to bring up is, why does this matter for those watching? It matters because we have a doctrine called extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Basically, what that means is that there's only one true church. We have this idea of one true church. We don't, like, why do we have to spend our time attacking other Christian denominations when we can just be Orthodox and let them be Catholic? Because we actually care about these people. We're telling them so that they can know that, unfortunately, we don't think they're in the Church of Christ. What the implications of that are in God's hands, but ultimately God established one true church for our salvation. And we believe it's found within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's a shame because, in general, lots of Catholics are very charitable people. You can talk to a Catholic and, you know, you'd get along fine, and you find that they do lots of charity work. They do lots of good works. But you can say that about anyone, really. You could say that about anyone. Mary, did your family come from a Catholic background originally? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but just...
Yeah, my mother did. She grew up down in Honduras, which is where a lot of Catholic, influence was. But fortunately, her cousin became an Orthodox priest, and because I think he's like half Arabic, and somehow Orthodoxy came down to there, and he has a Antiochian parish or something like that. I don't quite remember, but yeah, she said that from what I recall, my mom has told me that, yeah, like the Catholics were very generous, very sweet. She had like a lot of those experiences with like very faithful people, but it wasn't like, to her, it wasn't complete. And when she joined the church, she felt the wholeness there, and it was great. Like a big thanks to her cousin Padre Jorge for bringing her into the church. Something I like to think of with the church that you're talking about, it's like there's only one church, right? And I think of it as like Christ has one bride, one bride, right, the one church. It's silly to say that he would have multiple brides,
Exactly. Otherwise,
it's one bride that he died for.
Yeah, I would say that another way to understand this is that it's already been refuted, this notion, in the condemnations of Nestorianism, because Nestorianism doesn't just apply to the person of Christ himself. That's essentially what the dispute was about. Nestorius was proposing a dual subject Christology, namely that sometimes the Bible is telling us about the second person of Godhead, the Logos, active in the life of Christ. And at other times, the scriptures are telling us about this other separate human subject, Jesus of Nazareth, who exemplifies the human traits: crying, walking, getting hungry, etc. So there's a dual subject Christology in Nestorius, and the condemnation is based on the hypostatic union of St. Cyril, Ephesus, and then the fifth and sixth councils, which effectively refute all ideas, all traces of Nestorianism. So you can't have a dual subject Christology. Hypostatic union means that the two natures come together in the single divine person who has those natures. because it's the second person of the Godhead who becomes incarnate. Hence, the term Theotokos is a refutation of any notion of a dual subject Christology. So what this means then is that the body of Christ, the physical body that he took on, which is Paul's consistent model for the church, is just as localized and just as visible as his body. You see, so Christ doesn't, you cannot divide his unique presence in his body from the incarnation. Thus, you cannot divide his unique presence in the church from the single, true, one, holy, Catholic, Apostolic, Orthodox Church. It's that simple. And so if you divide Christ ecclesiologically, that's an ecclesiological version of Nestorianism. Oh, Christ is in the Orthodox Church, but he's also in all these other churches and sects.
Branch theory. It's branch theory. It's very toxic. Branch theory is like what he said, very similar. You're teaching that I don't know if it's a bit of a caveat, it's not exactly the same, but it teaches that every church has a part of the faith, and then when you bring it all together, then you have the wholeness of the faith, which is just absurd, because then that means that the early Christians didn't have the wholeness of the faith because they were one church at that time.
Exactly. And it also arises out of Anglicanism, which was a novelty of Anglicans trying to figure out how they could be a new state-run church, as well as being and having some connection to the church of the first 1,000 years. But nobody in the first 1,000 years proposed anything like the branch theory. They all teach the Orthodox conception of a single, visible, true church.
My question being, because I've heard Catholics say preach the idea of that they are the one true church. There's no salvation outside of their church, and also, like, I guess to go in, like, what are our differences in salvation? Like, what's the different ideas between us and the Catholic idea of salvation?
Catholic system is a lot more precise in terms of these phases and stages and types of grace. There's, operative grace, cooperative grace. There's sanctifying grace. There's all these different terminological distinctions that they have. And in the Roman Catholic system, it's really kind of a mechanical structure of whether you've paid these debts or not. And that's why, going back to the system of confession and whatnot, that's really the structure of how you're legally in good standing or you're in a debt standing. A lot of that has its origins in terms of where it departs from us in Anselm, because Anselm proposes the debt payment model for redemption. So in his structure in Cor Deus Homo, I think it's been many years since I've read it. I have read it, but he says something to the effect of, the Father, if God is infinitely offended, the Father is infinitely offended by sin, which produces an infinite debt, then it needs to be paid by an infinite person. So the Son pays off the Father. That is anti-Trinitarian. You can't have any actions in the Godhead which are between two persons and not the third. But once again, you begin to see, because of filioque and absolute divine simplicity, the subordination of the Holy Spirit in that payment method. There's actually a Byzantine synod that dealt with this in the 11th century, not directly because of Anselm, but because of a dispute within Byzantium where there was a priest who was, I can't remember if it was a priest or a deacon, but he was basically positing this idea that the offering in the Eucharist is either from the Son to the Father, or it's the Son offering his humanity to the entire triad. And the Orthodox position was stated to be, on the basis of the liturgy, thine own we offer unto thee, that it's the second person of the Godhead offering his humanity to the entire triad. So it is not the Son offering only his humanity to the Father. And so that, even though it's not directly about Augustine or about Reformed theology or classical Protestantism, it kind of automatically cuts off all of those options. So after Anselm, the Roman Catholic view develops into, again, this merit and payment model even further in terms of all these post-Tridentine doctrines and statements in Denzinger. So after Council of Trent, it really becomes codified that it's a matter of, when you die, do you have the accident of supernatural created grace in your soul? And if you die in that state of grace, then you will go to purgatory, pay off your temporal debts, and then you would go to the beatific vision, which is to see the essence of God with your intellect. So that's the Roman Catholic view of salvation prior to the resurrection. The Orthodox view is different because we don't have an Anselmian doctrine of one person paying off the infinite debt that you participate in gaining these merits from. We have the notion of participation in the uncreated energies of Christ through participating in his human nature that he assumed. The human nature that he assumed, he granted to it, he deified it with his immortal and uncreated deifying energies, John of Damascus says, citing St. Cyril, or excuse me, St. Cyril, by the way, says the exact same thing. In the letter to Sixcensus, Cyril says that the humanity that Christ assumed, he communicates to it and deifies it with his immortal and uncreated energy. When you partake of the Eucharist, you are partaking of that deified flesh, Cyril says, you see. So notice that Cyril does not disconnect the deifying grace that makes us, one with Christ from the sacraments, meaning the sacraments of the Orthodox Church, not the sacraments of any church, the Orthodox Church. So it alone possesses the deifying cleansing mysteries. So for us, that's how we participate in the uncreated life, uncreated glory of Christ. And that's the process of theosis. So there's for us, there is that purification, illumination, and deification process that we all go through as we progress towards the eschaton. So it's a very different model. In the Roman Catholic system, as I said, it's specifically stated in Ott and in Trent that the grace that you get in justification and in baptism in the Roman Catholic Church and in the sacraments is not the uncreated grace of God himself or the uncreated life of God himself. It is a, quote, supernatural creation, a supernatural accident in the soul. So very, very different. And this idea of created grace, which is dogmatized in their system, no matter how many times they try to deny it, talk around it, it's there, it's dogma, it's in Denzinger, it's in Trent. That's very different. And we don't believe in the beatific vision because of that. For us, the resurrection is the final salvation that we're all destined for. And so we seek a good resurrection based on whether we lived according to the virtues in this life and loved God and participated in the sacraments, versus this idea of an intellectual vision of the divine essence. Creatures do not see the divine essence in the Orthodox Church.
Essences, that's an important topic.
Yeah. Also, I thought of about going more into essence, like with God's essence, it refers to God's innermost nature that makes God who he is. So it presents like the unknowable, and other aspects of God being beyond our human comprehension. Thank you. My English stopped for a second.
Right.
So we believe in Orthodoxy that God's essence is not incomprehensible and cannot be directly experienced by human beings.
Right. Hence, the beatific vision isn't really possible for the Orthodox.
What
What is possible is the direct perception of the divine energies. And so Maximus says that, citing the Cappadocians, that in the eschaton, we will have a direct vision of God, but it's the personal energies that we see and perceive of the Logos, the Logi, etc. It is not the inner unknowable essence of God. So the essence energy distinction is very fundamental to Orthodoxy. And I argue that it's pretty clear that the Roman Catholic Church dogmatically does not accept the essence energy distinction. And you can see this from many points. The Fourth Lateran Council affirms, for example, the strict divine simplicity doctrine of Peter Lombard, known as identity thesis. So if we accept Lombard's identity thesis, and if Trent and other condemned propositions make the point that in the Roman Catholic system, you do not participate in uncreated grace, and if they always stress that the light of Tabor is a created light, we pretty clearly know their position on this, right? It is dogmatic that the grace, Trent says that the grace of justification is not the righteousness by which God himself is righteousness, right? So that it is therefore, as Ott says, a supernatural created substance, accident in the soul. So again, very, very different theologies because of, again, different triads.
So
why can't
I was going to say regarding like energies, wasn't that one of the biggest? I think it was energies and essences. Wasn't that one of the biggest?
Energy distinction.
Yeah, energy essence distinction, and also how like I think it's the Catholics believe you can know God.
So can you zoom in on that page? Like open it and just pin it so that
Okay.
while you're recording shows.
There we go.
So you can see, hopefully that I'm holding up the right one, but that's what do we got? Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, noting that supernatural grace is a created accident in the soul. Is that what it says?
Yes. It says,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, it says sanctifying grace is a created supernatural gift, really distinct from God. So it's a creature. It is not God.
Well,
the other thing, you guys go.
It was Saint Gregory Palamas when he had the massive debate between him and
with Barlam,
and wasn't it on?
Right.
Essence Energies, yes, exactly.
There we go.
Also important for the Essence Energy. I mean, that book really just nails it in 100 pages. But the triads is also important too, if you want to get the triads to, because he goes really deep into the totality of the energies doctrine and the triads. And also to make it clear too, that this is not some fringe doctrine that's over here in the peripheral thing. It's fundamental, because if you read the apodictic treatise on the procession of the Holy Spirit by St. Gregory Palamas, you'll notice that the doctrine of the monarchia of the Father and the reason we don't accept the filioque is the exact same reason that we don't believe in absolute divine simplicity and when we have the energies doctrine. In other words, these doctrines go together, you see. So you can't separate the monarchia of the Father from the uncreated energies. They go together, is the point. And I think when people see that, and not just that in terms of the triad, but if you notice when you read John of Damascus and St. Maximus, and John of Damascus is on the Orthodox faith, he talks about the energies in book 1 in terms of God's relationship to the world and the triad. But in book 3 is where it gets really clear, because he applies the two wills and the two energies doctrine to Christology, you see. And that's why it's so fundamental to the Six Councils doctrine, affirming St. Maximus against the Monophysites, that two wills and two energies, the energies doctrine is principally seen in the incarnation. I mean, we can talk about in terms of triad, but where the rubber hits the road is really in Christology. And that's where we really have to see, oh, wait, actually, like St. Cyril said in the two letters to Sexcensus, it is not the divine essence that is communicated to the human nature of Christ to deify it. It is the uncreated energy that's transferred and communicated to the human nature of Christ. Thus, in the Eucharist, it is the uncreated energy that you're participating in that deified flesh, you see. So easiest way to really nail down the distinction here is, again, to go from Christology to sacramentology and to point out to a Roman Catholic, you're not eating the essence of God in the Eucharist, right? Because they believe the Eucharist is body, blood, soul, and divinity. Okay, what's the divinity there? Is it another created grace? Jesus said that we would participate in uncreated life, immortal life, glory, the same glory that he had with the Father before the foundation of the world, John 17. Because it's not a creature. As Palamas says to Barlaam, if all we needed was another creature to be saved, then the Arians are right. Because the Arians said salvation is just another created state. The Logos, who's your moral example, is just a creature. Jesus is a creature. So Arianism is you can be saved by a purely created thing. No, the teaching of Ephesus, the teaching of our sacramentology is that we need God to save us through uncreated life, not another creature, uncreated immortal life and glory.
Yeah, why can't I just be a Scotist? Why can't I just follow Scotus and say I do believe in essence energy?
Well, this is a great question. So a lot of uniates will have this out, and they say, well, I don't really care about all this Palamas stuff because I can just choose not to be a Thomist, and I can choose Scotism. And Scotism posits what they call a formal distinction between the divine attributes, and isn't that close enough to Palamas? The first thing I would say is that it is true that Scotus is closer to Palamas just on the notion of the distinction between the attributes and the essence. But it's not a question of, is that good enough? That's not what orthodoxy is. You see, orthodoxy is much more than just admitting a formal or quasi-real distinction between divine attributes and divine essence. In other words, the Scotus system still operates within all of the other parameters of Roman Catholic theology. For example, if you get a basic text like Duns Scotus's philosophical writings, you will notice that he teaches a lot of the same principles that we would reject, like the filioque, like created grace, like all of the things that we criticize in the Augustinian system. So in other words, just finding one area that is similar to Palamos, it would be like if a Protestant said, hey, and I've met Protestants like this, hey, what if I believe in the uncreated energies? We're on the same page. The uncreated energies don't exist in a vacuum. You see, they're part of the rest of the Orthodox triadological conception, you see. The other thing I would say is that it really doesn't matter that there's people within different schools in the Roman Catholic system, because the Roman Catholic system has actually dogmatized a very strict doctrine of divine simplicity that we could never accept. So while it might be true that certain people, for example, Bonaventure, if I recall, I think Bonaventure says in his day, he thought that grace was uncreated. So if that's the case, could we just say Bonaventure is an Orthodox saint and we agree with Bonaventure and the Franciscans? Well, it doesn't work like that, because it's not a piecemeal thing. Orthodoxy is a holistic thing. So you got to have the uncreated grace in the sacraments. You got to have Orthodox ecclesiology. You got to be in communion with Orthodox people. It's not good enough just to have a single doctrine, a single theological point in agreement with us, because conceivably a Protestant could say, hey, I agree with you guys. I believe in the essence energy distinction. And some of them will say this, but does that make them Orthodox? No. So it's much more than just that. And again, I really just don't buy that the Roman Catholic system actually, it's like Heidi said, it seems to be a lot of different types of Roman Catholicism. So it's like some of the Thomist trads, I mean, in their conception, when Pope Leo made Thomism the official philosophy of the church, it doesn't make sense to have these Scotist positions. And again, if the Fourth Lateran Council identifies through identity thesis the Peter Lombard doctrine of the attributes being all the same with one another and with the essence, then shouldn't Scotus be wrong for positing a formal distinction? Because it was already defined that there's not a real distinction. So I just see this as kind of a clever, I mean, I'm not saying Scotus was trying to destroy. I think he was working with probably what he knew, and he probably saw some of the problems in Thomism, but that's not enough to be Orthodox.
You can hold Orthodox theology and still not be Orthodox. Like, you can hold 100% Orthodox theology and not be part of the canonical body of the Orthodox Church. That's
Great point. Great point.
How it is. But what I would really like, honestly, and this is not taking a jab, I'd like a proper definition of what makes something the Pope says infallible. Because, like, if they say, you know, he ratifies a document, whatever it is, so infallibility is defined as when he is speaking in his authority, official capacity in the see of Peter. But there's a million ways I can interpret that.
On faith and morals is the other qualification.
On faith and morals. Thank you. But he's done that before. Like Dom de Versaz is a papal bull. If a papal bull ratified by multiple popes, because they'll say it's not infallible now. If that's not infallible, then what exactly is? How does the Pope speak infallibly if his own, like a document that he's written, signed, propagated, and got multiple popes after him to sign and propagate as something that's binding to the church relating to faith and morals is not infallible, then that definition is ultimately bunk.
Absolutely.
And
well,
I just want a proper definition, really, because oftentimes I'm just talking with a Catholic, or they might be my friend or someone that I know, and I'm bouncing ideas back and forth, and I can't really get any leeway because I'm like, okay, do you believe this? And they're like, oh, that's not infallible. I get another document on that one, like, it's not really like, some of it's infallible, some of it's not. Or if you have an actual pope that is condemned by a council, he wasn't actually condemned. even though it's in the acts of the council.
Yeah,
It
and
says this
it's
guy-
also in the next two councils. They also restate the condemnation of Honorius to make it very clear.
I have yet to meet a Catholic who genuinely believes in papal infallibility, and I live in the West and have lived here for a while already. So a lot of their theology seems to be like just like a placeholder for like tradition and traditional values, as we usually say
Right.
on the podcast, really. So
Correct.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like this is maybe like a segue into a different topic, but right now, most of the people in the Catholic Church that I can, meet and see, and the parish that's in the town I live, they're more focused on being like, progressive and liberal than anything else. And so all of these medieval trends and that medieval theology, which points to a more structured, more rigid church, is kind of getting washed down now for, a new kind of conception of the church, which will be more liberal and more lenient.
Right.
Now with Vatican II especially. So then theology is getting adjusted and the debating style is getting adjusted. So like they flee from these theories of like papal infallibility or something that's going to, point to a medieval time or a medieval church that was really rigid and strong. And so now that the church is weak, their theology is kind of fading and starting to be this kind of Protestant influenced hippie thing that they,
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great summation of what the practical effects post-Vatican II were. And the result of that, I mean, that results from tying the church to geopolitics 1,000 years ago, right? I mean, this is really just the end result, because if the papacy can innovate and you can have revolutions, then it can innovate and evolve into the liberal way. Exactly. I think Justin Popovich said this, right? I mean, the papacy, he said, is just European humanism.
Which is what you find if you read Vatican II, it's already kind of veered in that liberal direction. Like it says Muslims worship the same God, the Jews worship the same God. Sure, there's this concept
Hindus
of
as well.
Hindus, but it says, by the way, that we have valid sacraments and orders, which I don't understand, because if you go back to, I don't know, Florence, you read what the Pope says. He says the schismatic, the Jew, the heretic cannot be saved unless in this life he joins himself to the body of the Catholic Church.
Right.
These are both ecumenical councils, and these are both, like, one of them is said directly from the mouth of a Pope. So how can they be in contradiction if they're mutually exclusive statements?
They will say that the conception of the church is not limited to the visible structure of Rome. So this is why Vatican II. Now you notice in Unum Sanctum and in Cantate Domino that you're citing there, it is limited to the visible structure of Rome. So they'll say, but look, Vatican II says the church subsists in the Roman Catholic Church, meaning that it also is outside the visible bounds of the Roman Catholic Church. And a lot of the trad cats, have a big problem with that phrase in Vatican II, subsists in the Roman Catholic Church.
Because it's obviously contradictory.
Well, here's their coping for that. The cope is, well, because we believe in valid sacraments outside the visible structure of the Roman Catholic Church, this then allows and opens the door for, via the Augustinian notion of ex opere apparato, the possibility of people being united to the church in heterodox communions. And so what they've done at that point to depart from the Orthodox conception of the sacraments is that they've separated the faith from the celebration of the sacrament, right? So in other words, you can have the sacraments now even without the faith, and that's why the Roman Catholic Church dogmatized that an atheist or a Muslim can baptize, right? That's foreign to the Orthodox Church because of the difference, a different sacramentology that didn't go the full route of Augustinianism. So this gets really precise and really nuanced, and people get really confused over this. But the doctrine of ex opere apparato was Augustine's attempt to answer the Donatists. And a lot of what he said was good and was a correct answer to the absurd rigorism of the Donatists. They were kind of crazy. But not everything that Augustine argued and said is what the Orthodox Church accepted, because again, it's from Augustine's doctrine of ex opere apparato that we get the idea that you can have atheists and Muslims baptizing people. And why do they think that? Well, so they come up with the definition in the Roman Catholic Church that a sacrament is matter, form, and intention. So as long as the atheist has the intention to do what the Roman Catholic Church does, he can baptize. This is absurd. I don't know, how does an atheist have the intention to do a thing that he doesn't believe in. I mean, it's just absurd. But this is the scholastic just absurdity that their sacramentology involved into. And the reason that's relevant to Vatican II and salvation outside the church is that it's that notion of the possibility of the severance of the ritual from the doctrines and from the faith, right? Because in the Orthodox view, my understanding, you can't have gracious sacraments apart from the faith. But that's precisely what this system does, is it severs those two things so that you can now have the gracious celebration of the sacrament outside the church. Now, the irony is that Augustine himself, even though he admits that it might be a gracious celebration of the sacrament outside the church, the fact that you're in heresy is a preventative, it's a block to the grace. So the grace is present, it's there when you're baptized in the Protestant church in the Augustinian view, as long as it's in the name of the Trinity. But because you're in a Protestant heterodox confession, that grace which has been applied to you you're prevented from benefiting from it. So you're still heterodox. And that's why Augustine can have that position and still strongly believe in extra ecclesia nullis salus. So that develops, though, over time, because the Roman Catholic Church, through various disputes and papal pronouncements, says, well, look, there's also baptism of desire, baptism of blood, baptism of fire, right, that we experience. And so there's statements that, well, could a person in another religion or in another country have the desire for what they know to be the truth, and therefore that counts as God sending them the grace of the church? So this is where they start going into that direction, and then they come to the idea, basically, was it Fratelli Tutti, the recent encyclical of Francis? It basically places the Roman Catholic Church as the center of a concentric rings of world religions that are all in varying degrees in communion with Rome. So basically, Rome is in the middle. And so now the Pope isn't just the head of the Christian world. He's actually kind of the head of all of the world religions secretly, you see. So outside of the Roman Catholic circle, you have the Orthodox circle because they're closest to Rome, but they're not fully in communion with Rome, but they have 70, 80% of Rome. Then we have Anglicans and Protestants, right? They're the next circle out. They have maybe 60, 50% of Rome. Then we get the Muslims. And that's why Fratelli Tutti included prayers that Unitarians could pray. Unbelievable. That's why the Roman Catholic Church has created the Abu Dhabi Multi-Faith Center with Jews, Muslims, and Christians together worshiping the one true monotheistic God. That's not the one true monotheistic God. The one true monotheistic God is the Father that the Lord Jesus called upon, that you only access through Jesus in the Spirit. It's the triad, that there is no one true monotheistic generic God.
And another thing is, people think that for some reason we hate Augustine. We don't hate Augustine. Just as an FYI, he's one of our greatest saints. We don't reject all of his theology either. We accept the vast majority of it. And a word that gets thrown around in this kind of debate a lot, which in essence you should do it, it's be charitable. But be charitable nowadays is synonymous with just stop talking. I don't like you. I don't want to hear what you have to say.
Amen.
What's the last thing I was going to go to is, I find that the last topic before we just have some short questions and we wrap up is so questions that audience members asked, just go through them real quick. But before that, I find they have a very scholastic approach to everything. That's the last distinction I want to make. Everything is kind of a legal system, which you don't find with Orthodoxy in the same way. We don't reject reason, of course not, but we don't have to break everything down into meaningless logic, because there is an aspect of God that's not, it's beyond our comprehension, it's beyond logic. Could you elaborate on that a bit for us?
Yeah, another good example of this is the sacraments as the mysteries, right? So certainly we can talk about boundaries for the sacraments, but there's no Orthodox notion of the scientific definition of a sacrament: matter, form, and intention. That's the Roman Catholic scientific definition that comes out of the scholastic period, like you're saying. And for the Orthodox view, it's not that we can't talk about these things, but think about the way the Roman Catholics view the Eucharist. For them, the Eucharist, the matter, form, and intention of the Eucharist is the words of consecration of the priest. So they leave out the epiclesis. They don't think the epiclesis has anything to do with the validity and the graciousness of the Eucharist. Again, which is again kind of silly. How could the calling down the Holy Spirit not be essential to the sacraments and their grace? It's silly. But they were searching for a scientific definition to make it clear when and where there is a actual sacrament being performed, including by atheists and Muslims. And this is where we get into the absurdities, which again, this is their view. I'm telling you faithfully what the Roman Catholic position is. If you were a Roman Catholic priest and the day that you were ordained, you became a Satanist, let's say you apostatized the day you were ordained as a Roman Catholic priest, they believe that you can forever confect actually and really and truly the Eucharist. You could sit there all day long confecting the Eucharist. It is really the body, blood, and soul divinity of Christ, to defame it, to blaspheme it. That's absurd. Again, there's no celebration of the sacrament outside of the faith, you say. And the Roman Catholic system is premised on that. And that is what leads to, that's the presupposition behind a lot of the Vatican II notions about, these other religions having salvific graces and whatnot. Anyway, that was way off topic. I'm sorry I got back into that. But I did want to make that point about, the confecting the Eucharist, because it's another way to illustrate the difference between our view and their view of the sacraments. What was the question? I got lost. Augustine. Yeah. So, yeah, Augustine is stated to be a father in the Fifth Council, and they don't list all of his works. I think they list the anti-Manichaean works as exemplary Orthodox works. Notice they don't mention all of his works, right? Donatism is condemned. I think Donatism is mentioned specifically as a heretic of the Fifth Council as well. But that doesn't mean that everything that Augustine taught about the sacraments is therefore Orthodox dogmatics. So, it's just like you said. Go ahead.
It's the same with any one saint. We don't
absolutely
hold one saint to be infallible. It's the consensus patron, the consensus of the fathers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Individuals can be wrong.
Correct. St. Photius says, if you read the Mystagogy, he doesn't say that the church fathers and the saints never made errors. He says that we should overlook the errors and be charitable, but overlooking them doesn't mean we lie about it and we don't admit that they made mistakes, right? For example, in the Ambigua, St. Maximus is correcting certain opinions that Origenism had seeped into the church to create, right? So Origenism, I'm not saying that all the church fathers, the Cappadocians, were Origenists, but they were influenced by Origen. And so some of the conclusions, for example, St. Gregory of Nyssa's statements about apokatastasis could be read in a heterodox way. And so St. Maximus writes the Ambigua, and he says, look, here are ways to clear up these ambiguities and even at times mistakes in the church fathers. So there's nothing wrong with, or it's not impious to be honest about admitting that certain church fathers made mistakes. And like Hattie said, it's about the consensus of the fathers, not the Roman Catholic or Protestant model of picking one guy. You'll notice the tendency of the Roman Catholic model is, let's pick Augustine and all of our theology builds on him. Let's pick Aquinas, all of our theology then builds on him. And then also, by the way, the Pope, you see. So it's always kind of picking this guy. Oh, that's the guy right there, right? That's the opposite of the synodal ecumenical council model, where if you go to, say, Constantinople I, yes, it's synodal, and yes, there are figures that stand out as important theologians like the Cappadocians, but it's still synodal. And Augustine said, I submit my book on the Trinity to the church to decide. By the way, he didn't say, I'm going to send it to the Pope and he can tell everybody what's right and wrong, right? He said, I submit it to the decision of the universal church in book 3. And so what happened? Well, did the church accept in toto everything that Augustine said about the Trinity? No, it went with the Cappadocian model of the Trinity at Constantinople I.
Well, I think we're going to wrap that up there. Before we completely end, I'm just going to ask for like 1 or 2 sentence answers to some questions that people asked us to ask you. So the first question is, I don't know, I didn't completely understand this one, but I'll ask it anyways. Do you think that psychosomatic prayer is odd or superfluous? I think that may be referring to hesychasm. I'm not certain. Do you understand?
Well, if it's referring to the tradition of St. Gregory Palamas, no, that's Orthodox.
Do you find, just elaborating on that question, do you find it repetitive, or is that a good? It is repetitive, but that's a good thing. What are your thoughts on it?
I think that if people are moving into doing that, they should consult their spiritual father. So, you know, that's a practice that people don't typically dive into right away, or if they're new to Orthodox or something like that. So I would say consult your spiritual father on that topic. I'm not going to tell people what to do, but I think there's a place for repetitions in prayer, because Jesus doesn't say all repetition is bad. He just says vain repetition.
Sure. Next question is, what translations of scripture would you recommend that people just stay clear of? Because there's many people translate the Bible into English. Are there any that you think are just bunk completely?
Yeah, I would just stay away from all of the Protestant translations and anything that's new. I typically just use the Orthodox Study Bible, and I know there's the Eastern Orthodox Bible, so those would probably be the best. I would stay away from everything else. I mean, if you're a scholar or academic, you might could utilize, you know, some of the Roman Catholic translations, like the New Jerusalem Bible or something like that. But I would just use that maybe as a cross reference. I wouldn't make that like my primary Bible.
And could you just give me a word on Oregon? What are your thoughts on Oregon? I heard you bring them up earlier. Could you elaborate a bit more on what we think about it?
Yeah, Origen was actually condemned by it's either Saint Optatus or I think it's Saint Optatus in his day wrote against him. So some people will say, oh, he was never condemned in his day. Yes, he was. He was condemned, by the way, not just at the Fifth Council, but also at the Sixth and Seventh. And he's condemned in the readings on the Triumph of Orthodoxy, the Synodicon. So this idea that Origenism isn't really condemned or Universalism isn't really condemned is completely false. And you can also
arch heretic. He's called
he is the arch heretic.
Oregon. Yeah.
And you can also read the book, The Confession of Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem, which is accepted at the Sixth Council, which has a 4-page condemnation of the entire system of Origenism.
Awesome. Next question is, what's the difference between absolute divine simplicity and divine simplicity, which we do actually believe? What's the difference?
Right. The Orthodox view of divine simplicity is that God does not have parts. God is not acted upon. God is not created. God does not have undergo change. His essence, his nature, his attributes, his being does not change. But we do believe that God can do different things. And that's the notion which a lot of Roman Catholics and Thomists would disagree with. And if you read Dr. David Bradshaw's excellent book, Aristotle, East and West, he'll point out that when the Cappadocians explain divine simplicity, they explain that in that day, in that time, the focus wasn't, are all of the attributes synonymous with the essence? It was about whether God acts or is acted upon. And so the idea that God is acted upon as if he can be changed or influenced is false. However, there is a notion of God being able to do different things. And so St. Gregory Palamas says in the dialogue with Barlaam, the Barlaamite, when God rested from his works, that showed us that he ceased the work of creation. So God does different works. So the very text that says God ceased from his works on the seventh day, St. Gregory Palamas says that proves the essence synergy distinction.
I think the last question is, do you think that Pope Honorius was in error when he got condemned at the council? That was just the question.
Yes, I think that the council would not make a mistake by excommunicating him for his theological error. He's not excommunicated because he had a private opinion. He's excommunicated for a public statement of error. And the Seventh Council and the Synodicon restate the condemnation. So again, it's not people try to play these games of, oh, well, he wasn't really condemned. Oh, it was just his private opinion. No, it's not true. He's condemned to the Seventh Council and he's condemned again in the Synodicon, I think. I know he's condemned again in the Seventh Council. I think that the Synodicon repeats him.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it. That's all the questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jay. I learned quite a bit.
I'm sorry if I rambled. I thought we would probably be going for a really long time, and that I didn't mean to like talk up the whole time. So I wanted to.
That's good. It was nice to learn more.
It's fine.
It was
Listen, half the time
was a
I'm too
good video.
stupid to talk, so I'm glad that you talked.
Honestly, like my only concern going into this video is like I was shown a bunch of Catholic videos of either abbots being way too radical in their belief. Like there's some guy in Paris who just ran a sermon on how Orthodox people are sent by the devil, and like encouraging people to fight Orthodoxy with any means possible, and just like some crazy dude from Paris. And I
That
definitely don't
sounds-
wanna. I don't
That's
wanna,
because so many
like,
people are converting, so they're getting upset.
yeah, I think so.
Mhm.
I think so. And then also there's like the very politically inspired, very liberal kind of, Catholic abbots that are just like, I watched a guy on YouTube. He was on like a big YouTube channel, and he was asked questions about like basic Christian principles like vengeance and like, personal vengeance and stuff. And he was explaining to the guy like, oh yeah, you can vengeance a little bit, if the enemy did enough wrong, then you can, like compromise your Christian morals, it's fine, and still be Catholic, just to like recruit him and stuff. So I don't want like this channel to become too rigid to the point where we inspire people to do unchristian things, nor too liberal at the point where we again inspire people to do unchristian things. I just
Yes,
don't
of
want
course.
people to use this as fuel against their neighbors, against their loved ones, or it's just theology. It's important. I'm not saying it's not important. I just don't want it to cause like bad feelings, hate, and
That's why
things
I
that are
made
not
a
from
point.
God, because hate is never from God. If you're
Yeah,
Christian,
I don't. I certainly don't hate Roman Catholics, even the ones that are really upset and come after us. I mean, I don't hate them, and I mean, I've cultivated a pretty good relationship with Tim Gordon, and we've been doing some great podcasts, and we're going to have a future civil debate on Palimism and Thomism in person. So yeah, we have a lot of Catholic friends still, and I don't want to be those people's enemies. But we just want the best for them, and to come out of the delusion and into the Orthodox Church.
Yes,
And another thing is, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Mary.
Oh, it's just another thing is that some like lots of Catholics don't really know about the Orthodox Church. A lot of them don't know much about their own faiths and don't question it. So they kind of are in ignorance.
True.
They don't
Absolutely,
really
Yes.
know. And
what
she
we try
give
to
them-
do is we're always the
well,
benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
I think we
Yes.
should always be charitable. So charitable, like I said earlier, it does not, and this is something before we can like sign off, to those watching, we want to be charitable with everyone, and we don't want hatred, just like Stranger said. So I've made a point of trying to just steer clear of being like, you guys are completely absurd as individuals. We hate you. We don't like you. No, we love Catholic people. We don't believe in Catholicism, but as people.
Exactly.
The only reason we're wasting our time doing these videos or trying to say, we think our theology is correct, is because we'd like you to have what we believe to be the fullness of the truth.
Absolutely.
And to give you that opportunity. Otherwise, we would love to sit down and hang out with you guys as individuals. But
Absolutely.
Bottom line is, there's one true church. It was established by Jesus Christ. And for that reason, we have to emphasize differences between the communions.
Exactly. Yeah, well put.
Otherwise, I think that's Carl and the Orthodox squad signing off. And that's Jay Dyer right there. Thank you, guys. I'll see you next time.